ancient warriors, prophets, kings, politics, conspiracies. No, this is just thousands of years of truth and history. It's the Word of God. And I'm Wade.
And I'm Jen.
And join us as we add oil to our lamps, learning from and applying the Holy Scripture to our lives. As we set out in a dark world and uncover the things that want to remain hidden by shining the light of Christ. Awake, O sleeper. This is Out of the Darkness.
All right, and in this episode, Wade and I are going to delve into 1 Samuel chapter 21. So in chapter 20, if you don't remember what happened, it is when Jonathan finds out that his dad, Saul, is actually trying to kill his best friend David. And he warns David. And so this chapter picks up where chapter 20 left off. And David is now on the run. And so we hope that you guys enjoy this episode. And thanks for listening.
First Samuel chapter 21. David went to the town of Nob to see Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he saw him. "Why are you alone?" he asked. "Why is no one with you?" "The king has sent me on a private matter," David said. "He told me not to tell anyone why I'm here. I've told my men where to meet me later. Now, what is there to eat? Give me 5 loaves of bread or anything else you have." "We don't have any regular bread," the priest replied. "But there is the holy bread, which you can have if your young men have not slept with any women recently." "Don't worry," David replied. "I never allow my men to be with women when we're on a campaign. And since they stay clean even on ordinary trips, how much more on this one?" And since there was no other food available, the priest gave him the holy bread, the bread of the presence that was placed before the Lord in the tabernacle. It had just been replaced that day with fresh bread. Now Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief herdsman, was there that day, having been detained before the Lord. David asked Ahimelech, "Do you have a spear or a sword?" "The king's business was so urgent that I didn't have enough time to grab a weapon." "I only have the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah," the priest replied. "It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. Take that if you want it, for there is nothing else here." "There is nothing like it," David replied. "Give it to me." So David escaped from Saul and went to King Achish of Gath. But the officers of Achish were unhappy about him being there. "Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one the people honor with dances, singing, 'Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands?'" David heard these comments and was very afraid of what King Achish of Gath might do to him. So he pretended to be insane, scratching on doors and drooling on his beard. Finally, King Achish said to his men, Must you bring me a madman? We already have enough of them around here. Why should I let someone like this be my guest? So, that was chapter 21. David on the run. Man on the run. Outlaw. There's a couple of songs going through my head. I'm an outlaw. Dead or alive.
Oh, goodness.
Whatever. Man on the run. So, David has gone to this location called Nob. And that's apparently where the tabernacle is at. I mean, essentially the house of God. And this is a credit to David. Okay, so he goes and he meets Ahimelech, the priest, serving in the tabernacle of God in Nob. So that's something that's interesting there. So the first place that David flees to on the run is the tabernacle. And I think, obviously, that's an important lesson for us today. David here, now, as we get into this later on, we're going to see some actions from David that I think we can all learn from. I think we'll see some things from David that we've all done in our lives. But this is a really important here that he flees, and as he's going, the first place he goes is the tabernacle. And again, for us as Christians today, it's like when we're in trouble, when we're on the run, if you will, from all of the, fiery, flaming darts of the enemy, the first refuge, we should go to is God, essentially, right? We don't have to go to a specific location. But hey, for some, that's your prayer closet or your prayer place. I find for me, sometimes the bathroom needs to be the prayer place because we've got a bathtub, and sometimes the bathtub works as a pretty good altar. Anywhere you need to be, though, anywhere you can go, you can find God. And I think that's such a important thing to take away here. And that it was the first place that David goes to. And now we come on Ahimelech, the priest. And he's startled to see David. It tells us Ahimelech trembled when he saw him. Why are you alone? Why is no one with you? Well, Nob is only about 2 miles away from Gibeah. Gibeah is the hometown of Saul. And so, as in the last chapters here, Saul's been trying to kill David. Some word of that has probably spread around. Ahimelech, it's not a long stretch to say that he probably understands a little bit of the situation going on here. I think we'll see an example also from Ahimelech as we go on. And you can kind of see how Ahimelech's trembling. I think one of the big takeaways from just in chapter 21 here is fear and seeing and experiencing all of these things happening at once can be overwhelming and flooding to the senses. And I think David's senses are being flooded with so much emotion. It's hard to not be ruled by your emotions like that. And props to David again here. He's at the tabernacle. He seeks out the priest. People would go out and seek these priests to get word from the Lord in that time. So, Ahimelech, he's asking, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? And David says, the king has sent me on a private matter. So we start off, though, as David, he's telling a lie here. And I think the priest here, he's also pointing out the vulnerability of David being there by himself, essentially. He doesn't have this royal posse around him to accompany him as he would on any other typical, normal, daily routine. It's like the king has sent me on a private matter. He told me not to tell anyone why I'm here. I've told my men where to meet me later. So, we start off with a lie. But now he's asking for provisions. What is there to eat? Give me 5 loaves of bread or anything else you have. I don't know what the significance of 5 is. But he asked for bread and whatever else. Now, we see the contrasting things here. David is seeking provisions. He's in the house of the God. Though he's said a little lie here. He's being a little bit deceptive. And I think what we'll see here from Ahimelech, the priest, is some of the mercy, some of the kindness that Jesus talks about much later on. But he says we don't have any regular bread, but we have the holy bread. Now, the priest, the bread of presence, this is part of that bread was replaced every Sabbath. It was bread that was baked and made and put on in front of God, essentially, back in Exodus. And it gets removed every Sabbath and replaced with new bread, essentially. And the priests were the ones that could eat the bread that was being removed. But they had to be essentially holy, eat that bread in a holy place. And now Ahimelech, who I personally think that he's not completely naive to what's going on. But Ahimelech is going to offer that bread of presence to David and his quote-unquote men that are reserved for the priests, if he can assure that they've abstained from any sexual activity, anything that would make them unclean. So David assures them, hey, I don't allow my men to be with women where we're on campaigns. And he's saying, since this is such a special trip, I mean, how much more are they kept clean? So the priest gives him the holy bread. And as this is taking place, the author points out that Doeg, so in 7 it says Doeg the Edomite, and he's one of Saul's guys, he's the chief herdsman, he was there. It says he was there having been detained before the Lord. So again, like I was saying earlier, people would go, they would seek out these priests, and they would ask for a word of the Lord from the priests, and they would stick around however long that took. And in a way, it's kind of increasing the tension here in this situation. Again, I think one of the themes here in this little chapter is fear. Starting off with Ahimelech being afraid of the reason why David was there. David being somewhat controlled by fear. It's causing him to lie about the situation. And then you have one of Saul's chief herdsmen there. So one of Saul's guys is there. Now, I wonder, and this is the example that we get from Ahimelech, offering the holy bread. If David had been honest, would he still have given him refuge? And I kind of think he would, given his character here. Because again, I don't think Ahimelech is naive to what is actually going on. I would imagine these rumors of Saul trying to get rid of David has been, it's been going on for a while. It's happened several times. Saul's tried to kill David several times in just the last few couple chapters. Word of that is spread. And now we have the main military guy showing up here unannounced without anyone around. And you'll see, right after the Doeg, seeing Doeg there, David's asking Ahimelech, hey, you got a spear? You got a sword? The king's business. It was so urgent, I didn't even have time to grab a weapon. Again, it's something that seems completely out of character. And for David, who's like the leader of Saul's army, a well-seasoned, well-trained individual, it makes even less sense for him to leave so abruptly that he would forget his weapons. So I think Ahimelech is a bit wise to this. And these are just things that I'm coming to from the text.
I thought it was interesting that he offered 5 loaves of bread. And it made me think of the New Testament and how when Jesus fed the 5,000, he had, 5 loaves of bread. Well, and 2 fish.
He had 5 loaves of bread.
Yeah. Because we see that in Luke chapter 9, starting at 18. Or sorry, 10.
You know what else? I was just thinking. So, with Ahimelech the priest, again, this is like bending these Old Testament rules. It's a Sabbath. That bread is for the priests. If we go to Matthew 12, Jesus references this exact situation here. We go to chapter 12 of Matthew. Let me read this real quick here. At about that time, Jesus was walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, so they began breaking off some heads of grain and eating them. But some Pharisees saw them do it and protested. Look, your disciples are breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath. Jesus said to them, haven't you read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God, and he and his companions broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. Haven't you read in the law of Moses that the priests on duty in the temple may work on the Sabbath? I tell you, there is one here who is even greater than the temple. But you would not have condemned my innocent disciples if you knew the meaning of the scripture. I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. For the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. And I'm just seeing there, this priest, he's showing that mercy that God is wanting. When Jesus asks, or a Pharisee asked Jesus, what are the 2 greatest commandments? And Jesus says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and mind and soul and strength. And what's the second one? And it's love thy neighbor.
Love thy neighbor as thyself.
I looked them up and I wanted to read them verbatim and then make it sound more official. I'll read the King James Version. And one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together, and perceiving that he had answered them well, asked him, which is the first commandment of all? And Jesus answered him, the first of all commandments is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. And this is the first commandment. And the second is like, namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is none other commandment greater than these. And I think this is a bit of what Ahimelech is displaying here. Sadly, in the next chapter or so, I'm wondering here, because, look, David told a fib. He lied. The Bible doesn't condone that. It's recording what he's done. Because then that would go against what God says. He doesn't like lying tongues. Ahimelech's going to get killed later on. Spoilers. And I just wonder if some of that could have been avoided had maybe David been more forthright. Don't know. Just speculation. These are some of the things we think of or think about as we read. These are things to reflect on. We also can see the bread also kind of representing the provisions of God. Jesus says he is the bread of life. I think in there also there's symbolism showing that despite what we're going through, God does provide. And I see Doeg here being that reminder, almost like the enemy coming in, poking and prodding, which then sets David off. Hey, you got a spear? You got a sword? You got something? I had to leave so quickly. I didn't have time to grab the thing I fight battles with, the thing that I use on my missions mostly. That main thing, didn't have time to grab it. And so what do they have there in the tabernacle? The sword of Goliath. And I wonder at the symbolism with that, the sword of Goliath, the giant that younger David killed in the valley. And David is really excited to be able to have this weapon. And I don't know if David is maybe thinking, all right, this is a provision of God. He's given me a weapon. But he says, Ahimelech tells him, yeah, there's that sword. There ain't anything else like it around. David's like, there is nothing like it. Give it here. And I just wonder where his mind is at as he's saying these things. The text puts it in there for a reason. When he's like, there's nothing like it. Is it because, hey, this thing's pretty wicked sweet?
Or maybe it's just like a giant sword.
It's a giant sword. This is gonna, a lot of people are gonna question messing with me when I got this thing strapped. It's almost kind of, you could get into, carrying guns or whatever. Again, I like me some guns and all of that, but like you question the why you carry the gun, what are you relying on protecting you and things like that. Is David here relying purely on the steel, Gentile steel, because of its impressive build? Is he putting his faith and reliance on this material thing to protect him? I don't know, but it's a question that we have to ask ourselves, though, as Christians. Again, what are we relying on for our protection? What is it that we are putting our faith in? And I think that's an important thing to reflect on as we read in passages like this. And we can sit and ask questions and entertain things, but I don't know where David's mind was at. I know I would be a blubbering, cowering fool. And I tell you, if I was in the flesh and I see this giant sword, I'm like, yeah, give me that one. Sup, Doag, what? Go tell Saul. As soon as he gets it, he heads out to Gath. And that's another kind of ironic or interesting thing. He takes, after he gets the giant Philistine sword that may have been a scimitar. Yeah, I was looking up all these different things about what his sword was like. It may have been a giant scimitar, which is a big curved sword. I was reading all about the Philistine warriors. There's some reliefs of them on Egyptian stuff, I think. I can't remember, but they had pretty intricate armor. It was feathered. They became Vikings. They totally became Vikings. Anyway, got the Philistine sword. And he goes to Gath, which is one of the main cities of the Philistines. Risky, but kind of smart. But also, I think it was in chapter 18, I think Saul had him do something. Was it get all the foreskins of the Philistines? Saul essentially wanted him to die by the hands of the Philistines.
Yeah, I think he told him to get like 1,000 or something. And then he got like 2,000. It was like double.
It was 100.
Oh, 100. Oh, see, that's how far. Like, I can't remember.
I know it's just a few chapters ago, but it was kind of like a few months ago for us.
Yes. I knew it was like, he told him to get a certain amount. And then he ended up getting double that amount so that he could marry Michael or Michael or however you want to pronounce her name.
I like to say Michal. But yeah, he's going into Philistine territory, exactly where Saul would want him to be. But also, I mean, Saul wouldn't exactly know to look for him in Philistine territory. I mean, this guy spent a majority of his life killing Philistines. So, of course, when the officers are unhappy about David being around, I don't expect him to be happy. But what's interesting is it's the Philistines, it's the enemy, that points out something so obvious. They refer to David as the king of Israel, not Saul.
And you know what? I didn't even notice that until you pointed it out. But yeah, it's says, "Is this not David, the king of the land?" And then they talk about the songs that people would sing about Saul killing his thousands and David his tens of thousands.
Yeah, I just thought that was so ironic, so funny that it took the enemy to point out the fact that David is the king. But
right. And sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. And at this time, Saul is actually the one that's reigning as king, even though David is the king that got anointed, or he got anointed king. And I don't know if Saul knows. Like, I'm sure he might, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that through all the actions that David has done, through all of his exploits, through everything, he by nature displayed the attributes of the king of Israel, the king that God is looking for. So much so that the enemies even recognize that. They acknowledge him. Isn't that the king? Saul's the afterthought. Saul's the thousands, David's the tens of thousands.
Right. Because, like we mentioned in the last episode, that, Israel was supposed to be this nation that God, was their ruling king. And then they wanted a human king. And so they anointed Saul. So it was pretty much God giving them the desires of their heart. This is the king that you wanted. And this is what's going to happen when he becomes king. These are the things that are going to happen. And then after Saul did his, he sacrificed when he wasn't supposed to, because that wasn't his job. He was being impatient. And he did something, and then God pretty much like stripped him of that kingdom. And Samuel anointed David.
Yeah, it was when, Saul had torn that robe of Samuel's. It was like the nail.
Well, it was like, then Samuel was like, just as you like tore this, I don't remember it for word, but
rend this from me. God rends the kingdom from you or something.
Along those lines.
But yeah, and again, Saul being that physical representation of the spiritual condition of the hearts of the people of Israel. And then David representing kind of a man after God's own heart. Still a man with
Right.
flaws, lots of flaws, as we all have lots of flaws,
And
all
we'll
of
see
us.
that later on.
Well, yeah, but God's at the forefront. Interesting here, like I was saying, I think fear is a huge theme in this section of text, because what happens, even though the enemies have pointed out this truth, what happens with David? He hears these comments and he becomes very afraid. says he was very afraid of what the king, Akshish, he was so afraid of what he might do. And so I just find it interesting that, again, and this example here of David living his life so that others recognize, and that's essentially kind of how we're supposed to live. It's not kind of, it is as Christians how we're supposed to live. We're supposed to live in a way that others around recognize there's something different about you. There's something different about this person.
Right, because our lives are supposed to point people to Christ.
But when confronted by this, David, when confronted by this, hearing that out of the mouth of his enemies, essentially, he becomes fearful. And then it leads him into acting insane. It's his last-ditch effort to kind of have some kind of mercy, being surrounded by his enemies, though he went to that area. But I think a lot of what is covered in this chapter kind of shows the irrational behavior that can follow fear. And of course, when people are afraid, it clouds our senses, our judgment. We're not able to think or reason clearly. We're not able to speak clearly. And parts of the body start shutting down when you enter fight or flight. All of these things. And it seems that David's got it down here pretty good, that even the king doesn't even want him around. But to recap, props to David for the first place he goes to is the tabernacle. That presence of God. Maybe he knows he's not going to be around that for long, and so he's just trying to get as much as he possibly can before he has to flee off somewhere else. I don't know. I mean, but from there, we get lying to a priest, possibly putting too much faith in a impressive weapon, and then he's in the land of the enemy for what? A position in the army of the enemy? There's just some very odd behaviors here that I think a lot been motivated by fear. But I mean, who wouldn't be afraid of what's happening, what's going on? So he got it right, initially running to God. And I again I wonder and kind of entertain, would it have gone differently with Ahimelech if he had been forthright? Especially when you have Elimelech displaying that type of mercy that God is looking for. And so with the presence of one of Saul's cronies there, kind of furthering that heightened sense of fear, it's then caused David to move further away from God in a sense, because he goes all the way to Gath. That's about 25 miles away. I looked it up. 25 miles southwest of Nob. Covers a lot of ground. So not only, in a way, somewhat spiritually kind of distance himself from God, but physically too. And he goes into the land of the enemy. Very interesting things here.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting, and a lot of things to think about and just see where the next chapter leads.
I think it's a study and shows us how easy it is to be overcome with like desperation, because these are like desperate acts. I mean, he's got a desperate need for self-preservation, and with that motivated by fear, causing a lot of illogical, talking, giving excuses that don't make a lot of sense, and then ultimately fleeing to enemy territory. And I think there's a lot of important lessons here, especially with trying not to become so overrun by fear and the desperate actions, physical actions, spurred on by that. Easier said than done, but that's why we have this text. That's why we get the privilege to study it and to reflect on it. And so we thank God for that.
Right. And I mean, not even just fear, like any like emotions in general. You know what I mean? Like, because we can easily be overrun by just waves of emotion and being led by emotion when we really truly need to be led by God. Because, you know, like I've been there, if I'm being real, right? Like we've all had these times where we go through like emotions, and not saying that you shouldn't have emotions, but to be led by them is a totally different thing.
Right. And one other thing here that I was saying, when David becomes so fearful, when he hears the officers talk about him being the king of the land. I mean, those officers are reminding David of his destiny. They're reminding him of a promise. They're reminding him of a promise from God. And it's a huge contrast to the David from chapter 17 who went and approached the Philistine giant Goliath because he was speaking out against God. Huge contrast here.
Yeah, for sure. And it just kind of reminded me of something when you just said that, about how like when we're all like first saved, right? And we just want to go out there and slay them giants. And then sometimes, like as you walk through trials and tests, like later on, you can still have times where like David is here, where he's like overrun by emotion and fleeing.
And he's fleeing from Saul, who, if you get down to it, isn't as intimidating as Goliath. And so sometimes, you know, some of the problems or some of the things that we're running from, we get this fear built up in our minds so much, and then we don't realize or see that it's probably not as big and scary as it actually is. So just some interesting things to reflect on. And that's about all I got. I hope that in some way this helped you. This helped you kind of reflect more about what's going on in your life. I hope it's inspired to want to dig in even more. I'm sure there's plenty of other people who can just dig in even deeper than we did here. And I hope it inspires and helps to spur you on in your life, your journey, your ministry, because we're all called to do something for God. We're all ministers for God. And we all spread the gospel in some form, some fashion, some way that's unique to each of us. And I hope that these shows encourage that. And so, until the next time, this has been Wade.
And I'm Jen.
And this was Out of the Darkness.
All right, so thank you again for listening to this podcast. And if you need a Bible, or if you know someone who needs a Bible, head on over to our website. It's www.outofthedarknessministry.com. At our website, you can request a Bible. If you need prayer, there's a place you can fill out a form, and that'll go straight to our phones. So we will pray for you as soon as we get it. Thanks again. God bless.